What if everything you thought you knew about Camilla's role in the royal family was a carefully constructed facade? For years, her actions have been dismissed as subtle or secondary. Well, recent revelations paint a shocking picture of a woman whose influence is far more disruptive than anyone imagined. Prepare to have your perception of the monarchy completely shattered. Asterisk, she stood at the window of Clarence's house, watching the morning rain streak down the glass like tears she would never shed in public. Camilla Parker Bowles had learned long ago that showing weakness was not an option in her position. The woman who had once been called the most hated person in Britain had developed a thick skin over the years. But even she could feel the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her shoulders. It was 2005, and the announcement had just been made. She would marry Prince Charles in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. The years of being kept in the background, of being the other woman, of reading hateful headlines over breakfast were supposedly coming to an end. But Camilla knew better than anyone that marriage to the heir to the throne would not erase the past or guarantee acceptance. It would only give her a new battlefield on which to fight. Her assistant knocked softly before entering. The schedule for the day was packed with meetings, fittings, and briefings. Every detail of the wedding had to be perfect. Not because Camilla cared about fairy tale romance, but because every misstep would be magnified 1,000 times by a media that still compared her unfavorably to Diana at every opportunity. The ghost of Princess Diana haunted every corner of Camilla's new life. 20 years had passed since Charles had first introduced Camilla to his young bride. 20 years since Diana had famously said there were 3 people in her marriage. The public had never forgiven Camilla for the role she played in the breakdown of that union, and she knew they never would. But forgiveness was not what she sought. Understanding was a luxury she could not afford to want. What Camilla wanted was something far more concrete: power, position, and the ability to shape her own narrative. Charles was different with her than he had been with Diana. Everyone who knew them both could see it. Where Diana had been emotional and unpredictable, Camilla was steady and pragmatic. Where Diana had craved the spotlight, Camilla understood its dangers. She had spent years in the shadows by choice, learning to navigate the impossible politics of the royal family while maintaining her relationship with Charles through scandal, divorce, and public humiliation. The wedding day arrived with typical British weather, gray and drizzling. Camilla wore a pale blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat that partially obscured her face from the cameras. She smiled carefully. Not too much, not too little. She had practiced this smile for years. It was the smile of someone who knew that every photograph would be analyzed, every gesture interpreted, every choice criticized. Queen Elizabeth did not attend the civil ceremony. The excuse given was that as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she felt it inappropriate to attend the civil wedding of divorced people. But everyone understood the real message. The Queen was making it clear that while she accepted this marriage, she did not celebrate it. She would attend the blessing at St. George's Chapel afterward, a compromise that satisfied protocol, if not sentiment. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall that day, not the Princess of Wales. That title remained too sacred, too connected to Diana's memory to be claimed by her successor. It was the first of many careful calculations, a signal that Camilla understood her place and would not overreach. But those who knew her best understood that accepting a lesser title did not mean accepting a lesser role. The years that followed were a masterclass in patience and strategy. Camilla took on royal duties gradually, carefully building a public profile that emphasized charity work and traditional values. She championed causes that were important but not controversial: literacy, osteoporosis, awareness, animal welfare. She appeared dutiful and supportive, always one step behind Charles, never seeking the spotlight, but always present. Behind closed doors, however, a different story was unfolding. Camilla had opinions, strong ones, about how the monarchy should adapt to modern times. She had watched Diana struggle with the constraints of royal life, had seen how the institution's rigidity had contributed to that tragedy. She believed changes needed to be made, but she also understood that change in the royal family came slowly, through whispers and suggestions rather than demands. She began building alliances within the palace. Staff members who had been skeptical at first found her to be practical and considerate, someone who understood that the people who made the household run deserved respect. She cultivated relationships with senior courtiers, listening more than she spoke, learning the unwritten rules that governed palace life. Her relationship with Charles's sons was more complicated. William and Harry had loved their mother fiercely. Accepting Camilla as their father's wife required them to confront painful truths about their parents' marriage. Camilla did not try to be their mother, or even their friend. She simply tried to be someone who made their father happy, who created a peaceful home environment, who stayed out of their way. William, dutiful and controlled, eventually came to an uneasy acceptance. Harry, more emotional and raw, struggled longer with Camilla's presence in his life. But both sons could see that their father was genuinely happy in a way he had never been during his first marriage. That had to count for something, even if it came at a cost they had not chosen to pay. As the years passed, Camilla's position grew stronger. She appeared at more events, took on more patronages, became more visible. The public hatred softened into grudging acceptance for some, though others would never forgive. Polls showed that a majority of Britons did not want her to become queen consort when Charles eventually took the throne. But Camilla seemed unconcerned by public opinion. She had learned that in the royal family, what mattered was not popularity, but usefulness and endurance. Then came 2013, and with it, the first real test of Camilla's influence. The Succession to the Crown Act was being debated, a piece of legislation that would end male primogeniture and allow daughters to inherit the throne on equal terms with sons. It seemed like a straightforward modernization, something the monarchy needed to remain relevant. But behind the scenes, Camilla saw an opportunity. She began speaking privately with Charles about the importance of clarity around titles and roles. If the rules of succession could be changed, what else could be reconsidered? What about the title she would hold when he became king? The Duchess of Cornwall designation had been useful, allowing her to build credibility without the baggage of being Princess of Wales. But it was always meant to be temporary, a stepping stone rather than a destination. Charles, ever devoted to Camilla, began making inquiries. He spoke with his mother's private secretaries, tested the waters about what might be possible. The response was not encouraging. The palace establishment remained deeply conservative, and many within it still viewed Camilla as an outsider who had caused incalculable damage to the monarchy's reputation. But Camilla had not waited 40 years for Charles only to be denied her rightful place at the final hurdle. She understood that direct confrontation would fail, so she began a quieter campaign. She proved herself indispensable to Charles, managing his household, organizing his schedule, supporting his charitable work. She made herself so integrated into his daily life that imagining him as king without her as queen beside him became impossible. She also began cultivating a different public image. Where she had once been careful to remain neutral in background, she now allowed glimpses of personality to show through. She made jokes with photographers, showed warmth in interactions with the public, demonstrated that she could be relatable despite her position. It was a risky strategy, but Camilla had learned that sometimes the only way forward was to take calculated risks. The death of Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Philip, in 2021 marked a turning point. The Queen, dealing with grief and her own advancing age, began to rely more heavily on Charles and Camilla for support. They took on more duties, represented the crown at more events, became more visible as the future of the monarchy. Camilla's steady presence during this difficult time did not go unnoticed by the Queen or by senior palace officials. Then came February 2022, and with it an announcement that shocked even the most seasoned royal observers. In a message marking her Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth expressed her wish that, when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. It was an extraordinary statement, a public blessing that many thought would never come. The woman who had once been too controversial to even acknowledge was now being endorsed for the highest title a royal spouse could hold. The announcement sent ripples through media and public opinion. Those who had never accepted Camilla felt betrayed by the Queen's statement. Supporters of Diana felt her memory was being dishonored, but others saw it as a pragmatic recognition of reality. Camilla had proven herself over 17 years of marriage, had shown loyalty and dedication, had helped Charles prepare for his future role. Whether people liked it or not, she had earned her position. But for Camilla, the Queen's announcement was not the end of her journey. It was confirmation of what she had always known, that persistence and strategy could overcome almost any obstacle. She had waited decades for Charles, endured public hatred and private humiliation, rebuilt her reputation one carefully chosen engagement at a time. And now, she was on the verge of achieving what had once seemed impossible. Yet even as she accepted congratulations and read generally positive press coverage, Camilla knew that her work was far from finished. Being named Queen Consort by Elizabeth was one thing. Actually functioning in that role, wielding the influence it could provide, using it to shape the monarchy's future, that was another challenge entirely. And there were moves she planned to make, changes she wanted to implement, battles she intended to fight that would test whether her hard-won position could withstand the forces that had opposed her from the beginning. The palace might think they knew who Camilla was, what she wanted, how she would behave as Queen Consort. But they were about to discover that the woman who had survived decades of scrutiny and scandal had not done so by being passive or predictable. She had plans, and the authority to pursue them was finally within her. Grasp. September 8, 2022, changed everything. Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle, ending a reign that had lasted 70 years. Charles became king instantly, automatically, as centuries of constitutional tradition dictated. And Camilla, in that same moment, became Queen Consort. There was no ceremony, no formal investiture. One moment she was the Duchess of Cornwall, the next she bore a title that many believed she would never, should never hold. The first hours after the Queen's death were chaotic. Family members rushed to Scotland. Protocols long rehearsed were put into motion, and the entire nation entered a period of mourning. Camilla, exhausted from the emotional strain and the sudden change in her circumstances, nevertheless maintained her composure. She stood beside Charles as he gave his first address as king, her hand occasionally touching his arm in a gesture of support that cameras captured and commentators analyzed endlessly. The public reaction to her new title was mixed. Many people, softened by years of seeing Camilla support Charles and take on royal duties without complaint, accepted her as Queen Consort with little controversy. Others, particularly those who had loved Diana, felt the final insult had been delivered. Social media erupted with debates about whether it was right for Camilla to hold the title, whether the monarchy itself still deserved public support, whether tradition or merit should determine such positions. But Camilla barely paid attention to the noise. She had lived with public criticism for so long that it had become like background music. It's always present, but no longer affecting her actions. What mattered now was establishing her role in this new reign, defining what it meant to be Queen Consort in a way that suited both her personality and her ambitions. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth was a global event, watched by billions. Camilla walked in the procession, her face carefully composed, wearing black with appropriate solemnity. She knew that every moment was being recorded. Her behavior would be scrutinized for signs of triumph or relief or inappropriate emotion. She gave them nothing, maintaining the same steady presence she had cultivated for years. After the funeral, after the official mourning period ended, Charles and Camilla settled into their new roles. Charles had waited his entire life to be king, and now, at age 73, he was determined to make his mark. He wanted a slimmed-down monarchy, more focused on core duties and less burdened by extended family drama. He wanted to modernize certain aspects of royal life while preserving the traditions that gave the institution its power and mystique. Camilla supported these goals publicly, but privately, she had her own agenda. She had observed the monarchy from the outside and the inside, had seen its weaknesses and its strengths. She believed that the institution needed to change more radically than Charles envisioned, that clinging too tightly to tradition would make the crown irrelevant to younger generations. But she also understood that pushing too hard too fast would create resistance from palace officials, who viewed change as dangerous. Her first major move came during the planning for the coronation. Traditionally, the coronation of a new monarch was an elaborate ceremony steeped in religious symbolism and ancient ritual. Charles wanted his coronation to reflect his vision of a modern, inclusive monarchy, while still honoring tradition. Camilla saw an opportunity to shape not just the ceremony, but also the public perception of her role. She began working closely with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Palace Planning Committee. She suggested modifications to the ceremony that would acknowledge her position as queen consort while being sensitive to public sentiment. Some of her ideas were accepted, others were quietly rejected. But the very fact that she was involved in these discussions, that her opinions were being sought and sometimes followed, marked a significant shift in how queen consorts had traditionally functioned. During these months of preparation, Camilla also began restructuring her household. She brought in advisors who shared her vision for a more active, engaged queen consort role. She increased her number of patronages, taking on causes that she genuinely cared about, but that also demonstrated her relevance. She gave more interviews, allowed more access to her daily life, trying to humanize herself in a way that the palace had previously discouraged. Some of Charles's closest advisors worried about this increased visibility. They remembered the Diana years, when the Princess of Wales's popularity had sometimes overshadowed Charles himself, creating tension and resentment. They cautioned Camilla about maintaining proper boundaries, about not seeking attention that should rightfully belong to the king. But Camilla dismissed these concerns. She was not Diana, seeking love and validation from the public. She was building a power base, establishing herself as indispensable to the functioning of the modern monarchy. The coronation took place on May 6, 2023. At Westminster Abbey, it was a smaller affair than Elizabeth's coronation had been, reflecting both Charles's desire for a streamlined ceremony and the reduced circumstances of modern Britain. Camilla was crowned alongside Charles, receiving a modified version of the traditional queen consort crown. She wore it with the same careful expression she had maintained for years, giving nothing away, revealing no triumph or satisfaction. But after the coronation, after the celebrations ended and normal royal life resumed, Camilla began making moves that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. She started speaking more openly about issues that the royal family had traditionally avoided. She gave speeches about domestic violence, about the challenges women faced in leaving abusive relationships. Drawing on her own experiences as a volunteer at women's shelters decades earlier, these speeches made palace officials uncomfortable. The monarchy survived by appearing above politics and social controversy, by representing stability and continuity rather than change and activism. But Camilla argued that remaining silent on important issues made the royal family seem out of touch and irrelevant. She believed that the monarchy could take positions on social issues without being political, that showing compassion and concern for struggling people strengthened rather than weakened the crown. Charles supported his wife, though he sometimes worried about the risks she was taking. He trusted her judgment, had seen how carefully she navigated difficult situations. But he also knew that the establishment within the palace, the courtiers and advisors who had served his mother for decades, viewed Camilla's approach with suspicion. They saw her as a disruptive force, someone whose relatively recent arrival in the family made her insufficiently respectful of tradition. Camilla's relationship with William and Kate became increasingly important during this period. William, now Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, had his own vision for the monarchy's future. He and Kate represented a younger, more relatable version of royalty, and their popularity far exceeded that of Charles and Camilla. There was potential for tension, for a rivalry between the current king and queen and the future king and queen. But Camilla worked hard to prevent such divisions. She met regularly with Kate, sharing insights about how to handle the pressure of royal life, how to maintain privacy while living in the public eye, how to balance personal desires with duty. She was careful never to overstep, never to offer unsolicited advice or criticism. She simply made herself available. Let Kate know that she understood the challenges of marrying into the royal family as an outsider. Kate appreciated these gestures, more than she sometimes showed publicly. She had watched Diana's struggles from afar, had seen how the institution could crush someone who did not know how to navigate it. Having Camilla as a resource, as someone who had survived similar challenges, was valuable even if their relationship was not warm or intimate. William was harder to reach. He maintained cordial relations with Camilla for his father's sake, but there was a distance between them that years had not bridged. He had loved his mother fiercely, had suffered through the very public breakdown of his parents' marriage, has been forced to walk behind Diana's coffin while the world watched. Accepting Camilla meant confronting complicated feelings about his father's choices, about whether loyalty to his mother's memory required maintaining some emotional barrier against the woman who had replaced her. Camilla did not push for more than William was willing to give. She understood that some wounds took generations to heal if they ever healed at all. She focused instead on being a steady, supportive presence in Charles's life, on helping him be the best king he could be. If that earned William's respect, if not his affection, it would be enough. Meanwhile, Harry's situation had become increasingly complicated. His relationship with Meghan Markle and their subsequent departure from royal duties had created a rift within the family that showed no signs of healing. Harry had made public statements criticizing the institution and, by implication, those who ran it. He had written a memoir that detailed his struggles with royal life and his complicated feelings about his family. In his book, Harry had written about Camilla in ways that were not flattering. He described feeling that she had leaked stories to the press to improve her own image, that she had been willing to sacrifice his and William's privacy for positive coverage. He portrayed her as calculating and self-interested, someone who had never truly considered the impact of her relationship with Charles on his sons. These revelations stung, even though Camilla had expected something like them. Harry's anger and pain were understandable, products of losing his mother too young and watching his father marry the woman many blamed for his parents' divorce. But the public airing of these grievances made Camilla's position more difficult, gave ammunition to those who still questioned whether she deserved to be queen consort. Camilla chose not to respond publicly to Harry's criticisms. Engaging in a back and forth through the media would only prolong the controversy and make the family look more dysfunctional. Instead, she focused on her work, on demonstrating through actions rather than words that she was committed to supporting the monarchy and serving the British people. But privately, she was hurt by Harry's characterization of her. She had never pretended to be his mother, had never tried to compete with Diana's memory. She had simply tried to make a life with Charles, to support him through decades of waiting and preparation. That Harry could not or would not acknowledge the complexities of the situation, that he reduced her to a villainous stepmother figure, felt unfair even if it was emotionally understandable. Charles was caught in the middle, loving his son, but also loyal to his wife. He made attempts to reconcile with Harry, to bridge the divide that had opened between them. But every conversation seemed to end in frustration, with both sides feeling misunderstood and hurt. Camilla stayed out of these discussions as much as possible, knowing that her presence often made things worse rather than better. As 2024 began, Camilla started implementing more ambitious changes. She reorganized the Queen Consort's household, bringing in younger staff members who understood social media and modern communication strategies. She launched new initiatives focused on literacy and reading, causes she had championed for years, but now had greater resources and visibility to support. She increased her international travel, representing the crown at events where Charles could not be present. These moves did not go unnoticed by palace traditionalists. They saw Camilla expanding her role beyond what previous queen consorts had done, creating a semi-independent power center within the royal family. Some worried that she was becoming too prominent, that her visibility was unbalancing the careful hierarchy that kept the monarchy functioning. Others appreciated her energy and commitment, believing that the institution needed people willing to work hard and adapt to changing times. The debate about Camilla's role came to a head during a private meeting of senior palace officials. Charles was present, along with his principal private secretary and several other key advisors. The discussion was supposed to be about budgets and scheduling, but it quickly turned into a broader conversation about how Camilla was functioning as queen consort and whether her approach was appropriate. Some advisors expressed concern that she was moving too fast, taking on too much, creating unnecessary controversy. They cited polling data showing that while acceptance of Camilla had grown, she remained less popular than other senior royals. They worried that her increasing visibility might damage the monarchy's reputation rather than enhance it. They suggested, carefully and respectfully, that she might consider taking a more traditional background role. Camilla listened to these criticisms without interrupting, her face revealing nothing. When they finished, she responded with characteristic directness. She understood their concerns, she said, but she disagreed with their assessment. The monarchy could not survive by repeating old patterns and hoping for different results. Young people did not care about tradition for its own sake. They wanted to see the royal family doing meaningful work, taking stands on important issues, demonstrating relevance to contemporary life. She acknowledged that her approach carried risks, that not everyone would approve of a more active queen consort. But she argued that the alternative, retreating into ceremonial irrelevance, was far more dangerous. The British people were questioning whether they needed a monarchy at all. The only way to answer that question was to prove, through action and engagement, that the crown still served a valuable purpose. Charles supported his wife's position, making clear that he wanted her to continue expanding her role. The meeting ended without resolution, with the traditionalists unhappy but unable to overrule the king's wishes. But everyone present understood that tensions were building, that Camilla's ambitions and the palace establishment's resistance were on a collision course that would eventually have to be resolved. The breaking point came in the spring of 2024. During what should have been a routine charity event, Camilla was scheduled to open a new women's refuge in London, a facility that provided shelter and support for victims of domestic violence. It was the type of engagement she had done dozens of times, speaking with staff and residents, touring the facilities, offering words of encouragement and royal visibility that helped with fundraising. But this time, Camilla decided to do something different. Instead of the carefully scripted remarks palace communications staff had prepared, she spoke from the heart about her own observations of domestic abuse, about women she had known who had suffered in silence, about the systemic failures that allowed such violence to continue. Her speech was passionate and specific, calling out inadequate police responses and insufficient funding for victim services. She named problems and demanded solutions in language that was far more direct than royals typically used. The speech received widespread media coverage. Domestic violence advocates praised her for using her platform to highlight an important issue. Editorial boards wrote approving columns about a queen consort willing to speak uncomfortable truths. Social media responses were largely positive, many people expressing surprise and appreciation for Camilla's candor. But inside the palace, the reaction was very different. Senior officials were furious that Camilla had ignored her prepared remarks and spoken without approval. They worried that her criticisms of police and government funding could be seen as political, as crossing a line that the monarchy could not afford to cross. They scheduled emergency meetings to discuss how to contain the damage, how to clarify that Camilla's views did not represent official royal positions. Camilla refused to apologize or walk back her statements. She argued that speaking about domestic violence was not political, it was humanitarian. The monarchy claimed to care about the British people, particularly the most vulnerable. How could that claim be credible if they remained silent about preventable suffering? If speaking out caused discomfort for government officials, perhaps those officials needed to address the problems she had identified, rather than criticizing her for mentioning them. The standoff between Camilla and palace officials escalated quickly. Some advisors suggested that Charles needed to rein in his wife, that allowing her to continue making controversial statements would undermine his reign. Others, particularly younger staff members who shared Camilla's perspective, argued that she was doing exactly what the monarchy needed, that her willingness to engage with real issues was making the institution more relevant. Charles found himself in an impossible position. He agreed with Camilla's goals and admired her courage in pursuing them. But he also understood the concerns of his advisors, the risks of appearing too political, the importance of maintaining the monarchy's traditional neutrality. He loved his wife and wanted to support her, but he also had responsibilities to the institution that transcended personal loyalty. In private conversations, Charles tried to find a middle ground. He suggested that Camilla could continue advocating for important causes, but needed to be more careful about how she expressed herself. She could highlight problems without explicitly criticizing government responses. She could call attention to issues without proposing specific policy solutions. There were ways to be effective without being controversial. But Camilla was tired of compromise and careful wording. She had spent decades moderating her behavior, hiding her true self, accepting limitations on what she could say and do. Now she had finally reached a position where her voice carried weight, where she could potentially make a difference on issues she cared about. She was not willing to go back to being decorative and silent, to pretending that empty gestures and photo opportunities constituted meaningful work. The tension affected their marriage in ways that both tried to hide from public view. Charles and Camilla had weathered so much together over the years. They built a relationship based on deep understanding and mutual support. But now they found themselves on opposite sides of a fundamental question about what the monarchy could and should be. Charles wanted evolution, gradual change that preserved the institution's core character. Camilla wanted revolution, rapid transformation that might risk the monarchy's survival, but could also ensure its relevance. Their disagreements were never loud or dramatic. Both were too controlled, too aware of servants and staff always nearby, to engage in shouting matches. But there was a coolness between them at times, a distance that had not existed before. They went through their public duties with practiced professionalism. But privately, they were struggling with how to reconcile their different visions for the future. Meanwhile, the media had caught wind of internal palace tensions. Reporters began writing stories about divisions between Charles and Camilla, about power struggles and philosophical differences. Some articles portrayed Camilla as a reckless radical, willing to damage the monarchy in pursuit of personal crusades. Others painted her as a courageous reformer, trying to drag an outdated institution into the 21st century, while her husband clung to tradition. Both characterizations bothered Camilla. She was not trying to destroy the monarchy or boost her own ego. She genuinely believed that the institution she had married into needed to change, or it would not survive. She looked at polling data showing declining support for the monarchy among young people and saw a crisis that palace officials seemed determined to ignore. She understood that her approach carried risks, but she believed the alternative was certain decline into irrelevance. The situation grew more complicated when William and Kate were drawn into the conflict. William, as heir to the throne, had his own opinions about how the monarchy should function. He had spent years developing a public service model focused on specific causes, like mental health and environmental conservation. He believed in using royal visibility to highlight important issues, but was generally more cautious than Camilla about explicit advocacy. In a private meeting, William expressed his concerns to Camilla about her recent speeches. He respected her passion, he said, but worried that she was putting the entire institution at risk. If the monarchy was seen as too political, it could trigger a constitutional crisis that might end with abolition. They needed to think not just about what they wanted to accomplish in the moment, but about preserving the crown for future generations. Camilla listened to William's arguments and acknowledged their validity. But she pointed out that there might not be future generations of monarchs if they failed to prove their relevance now. Young people were not going to support an institution based on historical tradition alone. They needed to see the royal family addressing real problems, taking stands on issues that mattered, demonstrating that monarchy could be a force for positive change. The conversation ended without agreement, but with mutual respect. William and Camilla did not see the situation the same way, but both understood that the other's position came from genuine concern about the monarchy's future. They agreed to continue the dialogue, to try to find approaches that balanced Camilla's desire for meaningful engagement with William's caution about political implications. Kate, who had been quietly observing these tensions, offered her own perspective. She suggested that perhaps there was room for different members of the family to take different approaches. Camilla could push boundaries and speak more boldly on social issues. William and Kate could focus on consensus building and less controversial causes. Charles could maintain the traditional ceremonial role that the monarchy required. Rather than forcing everyone into the same mold, they could acknowledge that different styles and approaches might actually strengthen the institution by appealing to different segments of the public. This idea gained traction within the family. It offered a way forward that did not require anyone to completely abandon their principles or approaches. But it also created new challenges around coordination and consistency. If different royals were taking different stances and using different communication styles, how would the public understand what the monarchy stood for? How would they maintain coherent messaging and avoid appearing fractured or dysfunctional? While these internal debates continued, external events forced the monarchy to confront new crises. Economic challenges facing Britain led to increased scrutiny of royal finances and the cost of maintaining the monarchy. Republican sentiment, while still a minority position, was growing louder and more organized. Every misstep by any royal family member was seized upon by critics as evidence that the institution was outdated and unnecessary. Camilla believed these challenges proved her point. The monarchy was under existential threat and needed to demonstrate its value through active engagement with societal problems. Continuing to rely on pageantry and tradition while ordinary, people struggled with cost of living crises, would only accelerate the institution's decline. She wanted to launch more initiatives, speak more boldly, take more risks to show that the royal family understood and cared about what British people were experiencing. But her critics within the palace argued the opposite. They believed that moments of crisis required the monarchy to emphasize stability and continuity, not experimentation and change. The crown's value lay in being above political and economic turmoil, providing a fixed point of tradition and reliability when everything else felt uncertain. Camilla's activist approach risked destroying that special position by making the monarchy just another political voice among many. The debate came to a head during preparations for the annual Christmas message. Traditionally, the King's Christmas broadcast was an opportunity to reflect on the past year, offer encouragement and inspiration, and emphasize themes of unity and hope. Charles wanted to follow this formula, believing that moments of national difficulty called for reassurance rather than challenge. But Camilla pushed for something different. She wanted Charles to acknowledge the struggles people were facing more directly, to speak about economic inequality and the need for systemic changes to address it. She had drafted language that was more pointed than anything a monarch had said in a Christmas message in decades. She believed it was time for the king to move beyond platitudes and demonstrate real understanding of and concern for his subjects' lives. Charles was torn. He valued Camilla's input and knew she was pushing him to be better, bolder, more relevant. But he also remembered his mother's approach, the way Elizabeth had maintained dignity and neutrality through decades of social and political change. He worried that departing too dramatically from that model would damage something essential about the monarchy's role. In British life, the Christmas message that was ultimately delivered represented a compromise. Charles acknowledged economic difficulties more directly than his mother typically had, but stopped short of the explicit social commentary Camilla had advocated. It satisfied no one completely, but managed not to create major controversy. Camilla watched the broadcast with Charles and felt a mixture of pride in his willingness to push boundaries at all, and frustration that he had not gone further. As 2024 ended and 2025 began, it became clear that the tensions within the royal family were not going away. Camilla had demonstrated that she would not be a traditional, quiet queen consort. She had a vision for what the monarchy could be, and was determined to pursue it, even if doing so created conflict with palace officials, with other family members, and sometimes with her own husband. Charles loved his wife and respected her convictions, but he was also king, with responsibilities that transcended personal relationships. He needed to find a way to support Camilla while also maintaining the stability and neutrality that the monarchy required. It was a balance he had not yet figured out how to strike, and the pressure of trying was taking a toll. William and Kate watched these dynamics with concern. They would eventually inherit these same challenges, these same debates about the monarchy's purpose and approach. How they handled the tensions between Camilla and the palace establishment would influence their own future reigns. They needed to learn from what was happening, to understand both the possibilities and the dangers of trying to modernize an ancient institution. For Camilla, the struggles of this period were exhausting, but also energizing. She had not fought for decades to be queen consort just to remain silent and ornamental. She believed the monarchy needed her voice, her perspective, her willingness to challenge conventions. The resistance she faced only strengthened her conviction that change was necessary. She was prepared to keep pushing, keep speaking, keep forcing uncomfortable conversations. Regardless of who it upset or what it cost her personally, the crisis that would define. Camilla's legacy began with a leaked document. In February 2025, a British newspaper published details from an internal palace memorandum discussing concerns about the Queen Consort's activities and their potential impact on the monarchy's constitutional position. The memo, written by a senior advisor, outlined specific instances where Camilla's public statements had strayed too close to political territory and recommended implementing stricter controls over her speeches and public engagements. The leak was devastating, not because it revealed anything the public did not already suspect, but because it confirmed that serious tensions existed within the royal household. It made private disagreements public, exposing the monarchy to exactly the kind of internal drama that undermined its claims to stability and unity. Media outlets devoted extensive coverage to the story, with commentators divided between those who thought Camilla was being unfairly constrained and those who believed she was indeed. Overstepping appropriate boundaries, Camilla was furious about the leak. She suspected it came from one of the old guard advisors who had never accepted her, and wanted to force her back into a more limited role. Charles ordered an investigation into how the document had been obtained by the press, but the damage was already done. The story dominated headlines for days, overshadowing the actual charitable work the royal family was trying to accomplish. In the aftermath of the leak, Camilla made a decision that shocked everyone. She requested a meeting with palace officials and family members to discuss her role and its limitations openly. No more whispered disagreements and private tensions. If there was going to be a battle over what she could and could not do as queen consort, she wanted it fought in the open, at least within the family. With clear resolution one way or another, the meeting took place in a private room at Buckingham Palace. Charles was there, along with William, Kate, and several senior advisors. The atmosphere was tense as everyone took their seats. Camilla began by acknowledging the difficulties her approach had created. She understood that her speeches and activities had caused discomfort and controversy. She accepted that her style represented a departure from how previous queen consorts had functioned, but then she pivoted to offense. She laid out her reasoning for why the monarchy needed to change, using specific data about declining public support among younger demographics, about increasing Republican sentiment, about the institution's growing irrelevance in modern British life. She argued that the traditional approach of remaining neutral and ceremonial was not preserving the monarchy. It was slowly killing it. If they wanted to survive, they needed to demonstrate value, engage with real issues, and prove that royalty could contribute meaningfully to contemporary society. William responded first, his tone measured but firm. He agreed that the monarchy needed to evolve, but he questioned whether Camilla's confrontational approach was the right path. Creating controversy might generate attention in the short term, but it also created enemies and undermined the consensus support the crown needed. He suggested that there were ways to be relevant without being divisive, to engage with important issues without appearing politically partisan. Camilla listened, but clearly disagreed. Consensus, she argued, was another word for blandness. Being inoffensive meant being forgettable. Young people did not need another institution telling them vague platitudes about hope and unity. They needed to see leadership that acknowledged real problems and showed genuine concern for addressing them. If that made some people uncomfortable, so be it. The alternative was an institution so afraid of controversy that it stood for nothing. The debate continued for hours, with various participants offering perspectives. Some advisors sided with William's more cautious approach. Others, particularly younger staff members, expressed support for Camilla's willingness to push boundaries. Kate offered a thoughtful analysis of how they might differentiate between advocacy and politics, between highlighting issues and endorsing specific policy solutions. Charles, who had remained largely quiet through these exchanges, finally spoke. He acknowledged the validity of arguments on both sides. He understood Camilla's frustration with constraints and her genuine desire to make the monarchy more meaningful. But he also felt the weight of his responsibilities as king. The need to preserve an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years through countless social and political changes. Then he made a proposal that surprised everyone. Instead of imposing restrictions on Camilla or giving her unlimited freedom, he suggested creating a formal framework that defined the boundaries of acceptable royal advocacy. They would identify specific types of social issues where royals could speak freely, areas where institutional neutrality was essential, and guidelines for how to discuss difficult topics without crossing into explicit political territory. The framework would apply to everyone in the family, not just Camilla, creating consistency while still allowing for meaningful engagement. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a reasonable compromise that could reduce tensions while still permitting substantive work. Others worried that any framework would be too constraining or too vague to be useful. But it represented a starting point for negotiation, a way forward that did not require complete capitulation from anyone. Over the following weeks, a small working group developed the advocacy framework. It involved extensive debate about specific scenarios and language. Where exactly was the line between describing a problem and advocating for particular solutions? How could royals acknowledge social challenges without implying criticism of government policies? What topics were inherently too political to address, versus which represented humanitarian concerns that transcended party politics? Camilla participated actively in these discussions, fighting for maximum flexibility while acknowledging the need for some boundaries. She won some battles and lost others. The final framework gave her more room to speak about issues like domestic violence, literacy, and support for vulnerable populations than palace traditionalists wanted, but less freedom than she had been claiming for herself. The framework was never published publicly. It remained an internal document guiding royal behavior, but its existence created clearer expectations and reduced the constant tension over whether specific speeches or activities were appropriate. Camilla chafed against some restrictions, but she had achieved something important: formal acknowledgement that queen consorts could play an active, substantive role rather than being purely ceremonial figures. Meanwhile, the family dynamics were shifting in subtle but significant ways. The process of confronting their disagreements openly, while painful, had created a foundation for better understanding. William came to appreciate that Camilla's passion came from genuine commitment to causes, not personal ego or attention-seeking. Camilla gained insight into the pressures William faced as someone who would someday bear ultimate responsibility for the monarchies. Survival, Charles and Camilla's marriage strengthened through this period, somewhat paradoxically. The stress of their disagreements had threatened their relationship, but working through those conflicts openly created deeper intimacy. They had proven they could disagree fundamentally about important issues and still remain committed to each other and to their shared life. That was a kind of strength that purely harmonious relationships never had to develop. Kate emerged as an unexpected mediator during this period. Her position as someone who had married into the family, but would someday be queen consort herself, gave her unique perspective. She could understand both Camilla's desire to make a difference and the institution's need for stability. Her quiet diplomacy helped bridge divides and find compromises when tensions threatened to escalate into permanent rifts. As spring turned to summer in 2025, Camilla settled into a modified version of her activist role. She continued speaking about domestic violence, literacy, and other causes she cared about, but with more careful language that stayed within the framework's boundaries. She chafed against these limitations sometimes, but she also recognized that achieving partial goals was better than being shut down completely. Public perception of Camilla evolved during this period. The controversy over her speeches and the leaked memo had kept her in headlines for months. But the coverage was not uniformly negative. Many people appreciated seeing a queen consort who seemed genuinely engaged with real issues rather than merely attending ribbon cuttings and garden parties. Polling showed that while she remained less popular than William and Kate, her approval ratings were slowly improving. particularly among women and younger demographics. The monarchy itself faced ongoing challenges that made Camilla's evolution particularly significant. Economic pressures continued affecting British families, and questions about the value and cost of maintaining royal institutions persisted. The royal family needed to demonstrate its relevance, and Camilla's willingness to engage with difficult social issues became part of that demonstration. In September 2025, Camilla gave a major speech at an international conference on violence against women. It was her most carefully crafted address yet, developed with input from palace communications staff and reviewed to ensure it stayed within the advocacy framework. She spoke powerfully about the personal and social costs of domestic violence, about the importance of supporting survivors, and about the need for societies to do better at preventing abuse. The speech received widespread praise. It managed to be passionate without being political, personal without being inappropriate, powerful without being controversial. It represented the kind of advocacy that the framework was designed to enable, threading the needle between meaningful engagement and constitutional neutrality. Charles watched the speech on video from an overseas engagement and felt proud of how Camilla had developed her voice while respecting necessary boundaries. But Camilla herself felt conflicted about the speech's success. She was glad it had been well received and knew it would help the causes she cared about. But she also felt that some of the power had been drained from her message by the need to be so careful, so measured, so aware of potential controversy. She wondered whether the framework that had enabled this speech was ultimately empowering or constraining, whether she had gained a voice or simply learned to speak within limits that made her less effective. These questions did not have easy answers. Camilla continued her work, making speeches, visiting organizations, using her platform to highlight issues that mattered to her. Some days she felt she was making a real difference, that her position as queen consort gave her opportunities to help people and draw attention to important causes. Other days she felt frustrated by all the things she could not say, all the ways she had to moderate her natural directness to avoid creating problems for the monarchy. Her relationship with Harry remained complicated and distant. He had not attended many family gatherings since his controversial memoir was published. And when he did appear, interactions were strained and formal. Camilla had given up hope for genuine reconciliation, accepting that some relationships could not be repaired. She focused instead on the family connections that were possible, particularly with William and Kate's children, who represented the monarchy's future. As the year progressed, Camilla reflected often on her journey. She had come so far from the woman who had been vilified in the press, who had wondered if she would ever be accepted into the royal family, who had married Charles in a small civil ceremony because anything grander seemed impossible. She was now queen consort, her position secure, her voice heard on issues she cared about, even if within limits she sometimes resented. The palace establishment had learned they could not silence or completely control her. The family had learned that accommodating different approaches and styles might actually strengthen the institution rather than weaken it. The public had seen that a queen consort could be more than decorative, could use her position to advocate for important causes, could bring passion and commitment to royal work. But the story was far from finished. Camilla was now in her late 70s, and while she remained energetic and committed, she knew her time in this role would not last forever. The question of what precedent she was setting, how her approach would influence future queen consorts, remained open. Kate watched carefully, learning what to embrace and what to avoid, preparing for when she would inevitably face similar challenges. On a quiet evening in December 2025, Camilla sat in her private sitting room at Clarence's house, reviewing her schedule for the coming months. There were dozens of engagements, speeches to prepare, organizations to visit, causes to champion. The work never ended, and the battles over how to do it probably never would either. But she had proven something important to herself and to the institution, that a queen consort could have a voice, could make a difference, could refuse to be merely ornamental. The monarchy had survived her challenges and been changed by them. Whether those changes ultimately strengthened or weakened the institution would be judged by history, not by any single generation. Camilla accepted that her legacy would be debated and contested, that some would always see her as a disruptive force, while others viewed her as a necessary modernizer. She had learned to live with controversy, to value substance over popularity, to focus on the work rather than the reception. Charles joined her as evening settled over London. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had weathered decades of storms to reach this place of relative peace. They had not solved all their disagreements about the monarchy's future, but they had learned to live with those differences while remaining united in their commitment to the institution and to each other. Outside the palace walls, Britain continued its endless debates about tradition and change, about the value of monarchy in modern democracy, about whether the royal family served a useful purpose or represented an outdated relic. Inside those walls, Camilla had made her choices about what kind of queen consort she would be. She had pushed boundaries, challenged conventions, forced conversations that made powerful people uncomfortable. And in doing so, she had ensured that whatever the monarchy's ultimate fate, she would be remembered as someone who tried to make it matter, who refused to accept that royal titles came with obligations to remain silent and decorative. The shockwaves she had sent through the monarchy were still reverberating, still forcing adaptation and evolution. Some would argue she had gone too far, risked too much, created unnecessary controversy. Others would insist she had not gone far enough, that the monarchy still needed more dramatic change to survive. But everyone had to acknowledge that Camilla had left her mark, had shaped her role rather than simply filling it, had proven that even ancient institutions could be challenged and changed by someone determined enough to try.